Hello and welcome to today's CUGC user share. My name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I am so glad to have you here for today's Encore Synergy presentation with Sam Jacobs. We're talking about building a XenApp real-time session monitoring dashboard. Very quickly go over our format today. We have a presentation with live Q&A. So we'd like you to use the question area in the GoToWebinar control panel to type in your questions, and we will keep an eye on those throughout the presentation and ask them at the appropriate times. Also want to let you know the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on mycugc.org. You will also receive a link to that recording following the presentation, probably sometime tomorrow. Moderating for us today is Samuel Legrand. He is the French CUGC leader and a CTP. And Samuel, would you like to say hello from beautiful Paris?
Hello from beautiful Paris.
Okie dokie. Samuel is going to keep an eye on your questions for us and help Sam out with those today. And without further ado, I would like to present Sam Jacobs. He is a frequent contributor, to CUGC, and we are so excited to have him here with us today. So, Sam, I will send the screen over to you, and you can get us started.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. There we go. Show my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I apologize. I'm just getting over a cold, so if I break into a bit of a cough, I apologize in advance. I would like to welcome you to this Encore presentation on building a XenApp real-time session monitoring dashboard. And this is basically the same session that I gave at Citrix Synergy last month. I would imagine that there are a few Citrix administrators out in the audience who can identify with the following scenario. You receive a call from a user that they're having a lousy Citrix experience, something that we refer to as high latency. You jump into action and investigate all of your backend systems, and everything is running normally. So now the fun begins, because now you have to convince the user that it's not Citrix. You can have the best Citrix backend that's humming along with the precision of a Swiss watch, and you'll still get calls from users regarding latency. And the reason is because no matter how finely tuned your infrastructure is, you're still not in control of the user's endpoint. They might be downloading videos, they may be running another process which is pegging the CPU, they can be far from a wireless access point, or they can just not have enough bandwidth. Regardless, those are none of those problems are Citrix issues. What's frustrating to me, and probably to you as well, is that in order for me to diagnose these issues, I need to be able to compare latencies across sessions to see if it's just a problem with a particular user, and I can't do that right now. There is no way for me to be able to see all my sessions line by line listed one on top of another with their latencies. But over the next couple of minutes, with some PowerShell magic and the XenApp Xen Desktop SDK, we'll show you how to create a dashboard that will enable you to do just that. First, a bit of background into qualifications. I work in the technology development division at IPM. We maintain premier partnerships with all of the major hardware, software, and storage vendors. For example, Microsoft, VMware, and EMC, among others. We are also one of the founding members of the M7 Global Partners Initiative. We are the oldest Citrix Platinum partner in the Northeast. I believe that Citrix just celebrated its 28th birthday, and we've been around for an extra decade. As far as my own personal qualifications, I've been with IPM for the past 15 years, where I've been customizing and integrating with all versions of NetScaler, Storefront, and Web Interface, going way back to the days of Enfuse and, everybody remembers, Project Columbia. This is the 5th year that I had presented at Synergy. I've led breakout sessions at Bryform for a few years before that, and I became a CTP in 2015. You can probably catch me on the Citrix forums late at night, and some of you may already be using some of the customizations that I have in the public domain. And you can also check out the CUGC CTP blog. I believe now it's called Expert Insights for additional customizations. So let's talk about our agenda for the session. So the first question that you should be asking is, why don't just we use Director? Hold that thought, we'll get to that in just a moment. We'll also discuss the tools that we will use to construct our dashboard, and we'll get to the nitty-gritty of actually building it. We'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of the session, and all of the code that you will see in this presentation, as well as the presentation itself, is available upon request, and you can just send me an email. I'll leave my email address up on the last slide, and I'll get that out to you. And as Stephanie had mentioned, the session is also being recorded and will be posted on CUGC. So why not use Director? Well, let's come up with a typical use case. Let's say the help desk is receiving calls from users that their sessions are extremely sluggish. And you also notice a pattern that the users that are having issues are connecting from one of the storefront servers, let's say in the UK. Now, an important point here, just because a user is connecting from the UK doesn't necessarily mean that the user happens to be in the UK, because you can have New York users who are traveling to the UK or vice versa. So anyway, how would you proceed to debug that type of issue? Well, what I would do is I would begin by finding out which users are connecting through that particular UK storefront server and check out their latencies. So let's fire up Director and see how it can help. Well, after you authenticate to a Director, you have a choice. You can either search for a particular user on the right over here, but that's not going to be particularly helpful in our case, because basically I want to compare latencies for different users. So I go to the London site, I select London, and I get my list of sessions. But there are still a few drawbacks to this list. First of all, as you notice, I had to select a single site. There's no way from Director for me to see sessions from all my sites at once. Next, I don't have any idea which storefront server the user connected to. And the endpoint IP address does not reflect the true external IP address. They're all internal addresses, and I may want to know the external IP address of external users. And most critically, I don't see any latency information in this list. While I can filter on different criteria, and I can also add and remove columns, the latency information is nowhere to be seen. So in Director, how do I get latency? What I need to do is I need to select a single session, and then once I do that, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a Details button, and clicking on the Details button will then get you the latency information. But again, there is no way to compare latency information from one user to another. So there has to be a better way, and there is. And that's the purpose of the dashboard that we will be constructing. We have the sessions from all of our sites on one screen. We also have both the last latency and the average latency for each session, obviously for only active sessions. Disconnected sessions do not have latencies. And we also display both the netscaler that the user connected to, if they've connected through a netscaler, as well as a storefront server that the user launched their session from. And that's not all. We can also add and remove columns. We can sort by any column, and we can add multiple criteria, as you can see over here, if desired, which would if you had, let's say, hundreds of sessions, would obviously make things a lot simpler. And if you click on one of the sessions and click OK, you then get to control a session. You could disconnect the session, log the session, log the user off, or send a message to the user, or of course returns the previous list. So how exactly are we able to accomplish this magic? The first component is Windows PowerShell. You may see it abbreviated as POSH in certain publications. For those of you who are new to PowerShell, we'll go into a very brief discussion of basics of PowerShell in a moment, just enough for you to understand the rest of this session. We will also be using the XenApp XenDesktop PowerShell SDK, which is installed automatically on the DDCs, and which is what gives us access to the command list that we will be using. Finally, optional, it's not an absolute requirement, is Visual Studio. Visual Studio comes in two editions, the regular paid edition and the community edition, which is free, and we can use Visual Studio to generate some of the screens, as we'll see a little bit later in the presentation. So what makes PowerShell so powerful? Well, PowerShell is basically the old Windows command processor on steroids. PowerShell takes objects as parameters, it processes them, and it returns objects. and the pieces of PowerShell that process those objects are known as commandlets. Commandlets are pretty much, you can describe them as self-contained black box pieces of code that perform a certain function. And I don't know, for those of you that may already be familiar with PowerShell, I don't know if you knew that PowerShell can actually talk and has speech synthesis capabilities, and we'll have a brief demo of PowerShell speech capability at the end of this session. Then there's the PowerShell pipeline, where you can string your commandlets together, which means that you can take the output of one commandlet, which are, again, objects, and you can use them as input to the next commandlet, and then you can take the commandlets, the objects output of that commandlet, and use that as the input to the next commandlet, and so on. So we mentioned that PowerShell's power comes from objects. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the command QUser. QUser retrieves a list of user sessions on a particular machine. Now, I'm not expecting you to understand all the code that you see on the right-hand side, but I just wanted to show you what code you would need to be able to get a particular user's logon time. So let's say I wanted to find out when a particular user, let's say the first user, Stephanie Johnson, when she logged on. Okay, so this is the code that I would need to use to get her logon time. What I need to do is I need to parse each of the lines of output of QUser into individual words. I need to then check to see if I'm looking at Stephanie Johnson's particular session, and then I need to parse to get her logon time. And I need to be careful because active sessions and disconnected sessions have a different number of fields on the line. As you can see, the disconnected sessions do not have a session name while active sessions do. Excuse me. So I have to be aware of that. However, using objects makes things much, much easier. So here's an example using Shay Levy's PowerShell module called PS Terminal Services. For starters, it turns the output of QUser into PowerShell objects. I mean, you can do quite a bit more than that. You can enumerate all of your terminal server and their sessions. You can enumerate processes, perform operations. You can select only the columns you want, etc., etc., etc. But all you need when you're using objects is a simple command. So here, basically, we're saying, bring me the terminal session where the username is equal to S. Johnson, Stephanie Johnson, and I'm interested in the logon time. Now, as we mentioned, PowerShell commandlets are objects, are basically discrete objects that return data in the form of objects. And what we're going to use for our dashboard is the XenApp PowerShell commandlet called Get-BrokerSession. Now, Get-BrokerSession returns about 75 different variables for each session, and those are, you can see over here. Now, I can use all of those 75 variables if I wanted to, but the line would get quite crowded. My display would get quite crowded if we did use all of those options. So what we're going to do is we're going to just hone it down to a couple of critical ones, and we're going to go through each of those in turn. So these are the ones that we're going to use. So the first one is client name. The client name is the name of the user's machine. The client version will depend whether or not I'm using the native receiver or the HTML5 receiver. The version obviously will be different. The connected via host name is the NetScaler VIP that the user connected to if the user is connecting through a NetScaler. If the user, the launched via host name is the storefront server, especially if you have more than one storefront server in your server group. So in case one of them is acting erratically, you'll know which storefront server the user happened to connect to. The machine name, which is the hosting XenApp server, which the user's session gets instantiated on. The protocol, which is usually HDX, but it can also be RDP or console. The receiver IP address, which will be the IP of the user's device, and if the user is external, it will be the external IP address of the user. The session state, whether the user is active or disconnected. The session state change time, which is when the state changed from active to disconnected or vice versa, and you can calculate the time that the user has been in that state by simply subtracting that time from the current time. The start time, the time that the user actually logged into the session. The user ID, now we don't really need to display the user ID on the screen for the user. The user really doesn't care what that ID is, but we're going to need this user ID to be able to control the session. If we want to send a message to the user or log off the user or disconnect the user, this is the ID that we will use to do that. So we want to keep track of that. And the user's name. Now, again, you may not use all of these variables or attributes, and you may decide to add some more to your dashboard. Again, you'll have the codes for this if you wish, so you can manipulate it as you see fit. And if you ever want to know what the full complement of all of those 75 or so variables are, you simply need to use the standard help syntax for getting help for PowerShell, which is get help, and for this for the Get-BrokerSession commandlet, which is the one we just spoke about. Now, let's see how we retrieve information from the commandlets, from the XenApp and desktop PowerShell commandlets. As we mentioned before we can use them, we need to load them into the PowerShell session. The syntax for all commandlets is a verb noun. So as you can see here, add PS snap in. Now, most commandlets have an alias, which is basically a much shorter version of the commandlets. The alias for the commandlet name, the alias for add PS snap in is ASNP. And either of them can be used interchangeably. We are telling PowerShell to load the broker admin commandlets. Now, if you don't want to type in the whole citrix.broker.admin or just lazy like me, you can just type in ASNP Citrix star, which will load all of the session commandlets that the system finds on the machine. So if we want to get a list of the sessions, all we need to do is execute the Get-BrokerSession commandlet. Again, once, of course, the commandlets have been loaded. And as we mentioned before, the output of commandlets are objects. So we assign those objects to a PowerShell variable. All PowerShell variables are prefixed by a $. So the PowerShell variable session list, after I execute the broker session commandlet, would contain all of my sessions. However, we don't want every session because some of the sessions don't actually have users connected to them. So what we want to do is we want to qualify that by returning only sessions that have users. So we use another commandlet called the where object commandlet to add criteria that the username should not be null. Now, if you notice the pipe symbol, that's an example of the pipeline where the output of the Get-BrokerSession commandlet is passed to the next commandlet, to the where object commandlet. So the Get-BrokerSession commandlet returns the entire universe of all sessions, and the where object will filter out any sessions where the username is null and just add that to the session list. However, now the where object commandlet again also has aliases. There are two aliases to that. The first one is just simply where, which is makes a lot, it's more English than just where object. And there's even a shorter version of the where object commandlet, and that's just a question mark. And the where object commandlet is what we saw before with it. You had the underscore, let me go back there a second. The $_ specific syntax is basically saying as you go through each of the session objects, simply as you go through the session objects, simply substitute and check the username where it's not equal to null. And as I said before, there's a shorter version, just $. Do that. Now we don't necessarily want all of the objects returned. So we only want, as we mentioned before, we don't need all 75 attributes returned. So we only want the ones that we had specified before. So again, we pipe the output of this second commandlet into the next commandlet, which is the select object commandlet. And that select object commandlet also has an alias called simply select. So the select user and just select the objects or the variables that we are interested in. Now, when retrieving the information is just half of the story, it's not much value to us to just retrieve the information. We now need to show it to the user, to display that to the user. Now in PowerShell, you can display information by just mentioning the variable containing it. So by default, PowerShell displays information in a list format, as you can see over here, which will quickly roll off the screen if you have more than one or two sessions. It will be a lot more helpful if we could display the information in a more tabular format, as we had seen before. And PowerShell obliges with the format table commandlet. The format table commandlet has an alias ft, and we can see a nice formatted list of sessions. And again, all you have to do is take the session list variable that we had gotten all of the session objects from, pass that to format table, and it will format all of the fields from all of the sessions in a nice format. Now, this is much nicer. However, we really can't do much with this. It's static. We can't sort. We can't filter. We can't do anything to the user sessions. So I would like to introduce you to one of, if not the most powerful PowerShell commandlet, in my opinion, called outGridView. Now, the input to outGridView is a set of objects. In our case, it's just the list of sessions returned earlier by Get-BrokerSession, and it's in the session list. And it creates this wonderful GUI out of that and allows you to manipulate it. You can, and I guess the best way of showing you is by giving you a little demo. So let me get out of here. So here is the outGridView demo. You can see I can sort by clicking on any header. I can move names, or I can move columns around, and I can filter. I can add criteria. So for example, if I wanted to see anybody in a particular who logged on from a particular storefront server, I can just add that as criteria, and I can just say, okay, I want to see only users from the UK, and if I want to see users from only from STF01, for example. And once I select a particular user and click OK, then I can get a list over here. Then I get another screen that asks the administrator, what do you want to do? Do you want to disconnect the session? You want to log of the session? And then send a message to the user or return. Excuse me. Now, I want to show you how powerful this outGridView command is, because these options here, in addition to being able to take the input from a list of sessions, you can also take, like this screen is done through outGridView, and I simply had to do the following. I just had to create, this, if you notice, this is a notepad where I just list the actions that I want the user to, the actions that the user can possibly take, and they can select from this, and then I can check to see which one the user actually selected, and then perform the particular action that the user requested. So it's extremely, extremely powerful. Okay. Now, the Get-BrokerSession and the outGridView commandlets, they do most of the work for us, but we're going to need a few more commandlets to round out the information that we need. And we'll need to add a few more lines to our script for that. So, for example, if you're dealing with multiple sites, you're going to need to get the site name. And the way you get the site name is from the Get-BrokerSite commandlet. So we get the Get-BrokerSite commandlet, and we put that into another PowerShell commandlet called site name. If you want to, if you launch an application instead of a desktop, the applications that you launched are not retrieved through Get-BrokerSession. That's retrieved through a Get-Broker desktop group, and we have to match the to the session name using that UID that we had seen before, and pull out the published name. So that's how we do that. Now, we're using multiple PowerShell commandlets. However, the outGridView can only show information from one record at a time. So we need to have a way to merge the output from the multiple commandlets into a single object. And we do that by basically creating our own custom PowerShell object. And it's very simple to do. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. And what you'd simply do is you issue the command that you set your PowerShell object, my object. You're creating a new object. PS object just means create your own custom PowerShell object. And you tell it the properties or fields that you are interested in. And here you see the one, this is just a sampling of the ones that we're interested in. And you can then assign the values that you get from each of the commandlets. So the site name is gotten from the Get-BrokerSite commandlet. We had assigned that a bit earlier to the site name. The application name we had gotten from the Get-Broker desktop group commandlet, so we assigned that to the appropriate field, and the other ones we get from the Get-BrokerSession commandlets. Now, the commandlets that we were talking about, which are part of the XenApp and Desktop PowerShell SDK, are installed on your DDCs and will need to be executed there. Now, if you're going to give the power to your help desk, for example, you're not going to want everybody RDPing into your DDCs. So we need to have some method to execute our commands remotely. Now, there are three methods that we can use for remote execution. The first, enter PS session, it creates a persistent PowerShell connection to the DDC. For all intents and purposes, it's just like you've RDP'd into the server, and you are brought to a PowerShell command prompt, and any commands that you enter are executed on that server until you hit the exit PS session command. Now, enter PS session is useful when you want to execute one or two commands on the remote server, but it won't work for us here. While you do have access to a PowerShell console on the remote server, you don't have access to the entire computer. So if any pop-up messages, any pop-ups or message boxes would come up, you would not be able to see them. So that's why you cannot execute any commands that have any sort of GUI, such as message box or outgrid view in our case. And if you try, you're going to get this nasty message reminding you that outgrid view does not work in a remote session. The next way to do remote execution is by using the admin address parameter. Now, you can use the admin address parameter, but the problem is when if you try doing that, you're going to get the message that Get-BrokerSession is not recognized, and that is because you're probably executing this on the help desk user's PC, and you do not have the XenApp Xen Desktop SDK loaded on their PC. Now, you can, if you wish, go ahead and load the PowerShell SDK on each user's machine, but that's probably not something you want to do. So we then go to the preferred method, which is the invoke command commandlet. And what the invoke commandlet will do is it will execute a script lock on your DDC. Now, script lock is just a fancy term for a set of commands to execute, and the machine that you're actually executing this on does not need to know what those commands are. So it will send that entire script lock, all of those commands, to the server, which the server is the DDC again, and those commands will be executed on that server, and the results will be put into this variable called output. Now that we see how we pass commands using invoke commands to retrieve session information, we can use another command, commandlet called the for each object commandlet to actually support multiple sites. So if we see that, and now the for each commandlet also has two aliases. The first alias is for each, and the second alias is a %sign. And you can always use aliases interdependently, and you basically specify invoke command, and using the for each command, and again you have this $_ which says that every time you go through this for each object loop, replace it with one of the DDCs. So we take the DDC list that we have over here. Using the pipeline, we pass that DDC list, which is NY DDC01 and UK DDC01, and we pass that to the for each object. And the for each object basically does a do loop through the list of DDCs. The first time through the loop, it will replace this placeholder, the $_ with the New York DDC01, and the second time through the loop, it'll replace it with UK DDC01. Now, the session list that is returned from the invoke command, we then simply add those sessions to another PowerShell variable called all sessions, which will contain the list of all the sessions from all of our sites, and then we simply, all we need to do is pass that all sessions variable to outgrid view, excuse me, and then display that list. Now let's talk about latency. Now, none of the commandlets in the XenApp XenDesktop SDK return session latency. So we have to think a little bit out of the box. Now, latency is a perfmon counter, which is installed together with XenApp on your hosting servers. There's a PowerShell commandlet, a standard PowerShell commandlet called Get-Counter, which can retrieve the values of perfmon counters. But the problem is that we also need to provide the counter path, as you can see over here, which includes a session name. So, for example, the counter path over here, ICATCP1 for Stephanie Johnson, if we wanted to get the information from her for her session, the latency information for her session. The problem is that the session name is not returned by any of these XenApp XenDesktop section commandlets either. So we need to do, as I mentioned before, is think out of the box and go back to what we saw before, which is the QUser command. Now, the QUser command, it does have the session name, as we had seen earlier, and what we simply need to do is we can parse the output of the QUser command to get Stephanie's session name, and then we can pass her session name as well as her username to retrieve the latencies for last recorded and session average. Now, you may also want to use a wildcard with the latency getting the perfmon counters. Now, with the wildcard, you don't have to specify an individual counter path. You just specify an asterisk saying you want to return all of the last recorded latencies for a particular host, or all of the session average latencies for a particular host. Now, the reason why you may want to do this, even though you then have to look through all of the records to find Stephanie's latency, is because if you need to go, as I mentioned before, to each individual host to retrieve session information. And if you have your host located across the pond, which I would imagine that UK hosts would usually be located over there, then, excuse me, you would have to make, let's say you have 20 users sessions on a particular host. That means that you would have to make actually 40 calls across the network to get latencies, because we're getting two values of latency, the last recorded and the session average for each of those sessions. So 40 calls can get pretty expensive. It's a lot easier to just make 2 calls, as you can see over here, and then search the list of return latency values for the user, for Stephanie's latency values. It's much quicker. So the way that we get the latency values is we issue the get-counter command, as we see over here. Here we're going to get taking advantage of the asterisk, the wildcard character, and we're getting all of the session average values for the particular server that Stephanie is on, and we return it in this PowerShell variable called average latency. And as you can see over here, it returns an object. It returns a timestamp, as well as something called counter samples. Okay. Now remember, it returns objects. So the counter samples object itself is an object, and therefore, when I ask, all I have to do in order to get, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. In order to get the value of Stephanie's latency value, since I know that her session name is ICATCP1, all I need to do is to get the counter samples, and then remember that $ is a alias for the where object commandlet, where the path matches ICATCP1. Now, I would expect that after I issue this commandlet, I would get the value of 57 because that's what appears to be her session average latency value. However, that is not the case because, again, this also returns an object, and the object in this case is composed of 3 fields. It's the path itself, it's the instance name, and something called a cooked value, which is just I know it's a funny name, but that's the value that perform counters are returned in, and that's actually the value that we are interested in. So let's take a little recap of what we need to do. We need to issue the get counter call. We then need to search and match on the user's session name, and then we need to get the cooked value, and we will finally get the value of 57. Now, for those of you that may have worked with PowerShell before, you probably know that you can probably condense this into a much easier version, but you have to be very careful when you do that. Because, for example, this, which you might think will work, will not work, and the reason it won't work is because if you ask for the cooked value first, then what you're doing is you're only pulling out the cooked values, and you no longer have the path to match on. If you wanted to make a more shortened version, what you would need to do is you would need to issue this call, which is you need to put parentheses around the matching, which basically says I want to match first on the user session name, and after you do the matching, then select the cooked value, and then you'll get the correct value. Now, once we've selected a particular session, as we mentioned before, we also have the option of disconnecting the user, stopping the user. Stopping is just another word for logging off, and we can also send a message to the user using, now these commandlets are also part of the XenApp Xen Desktop SDK, and we just have to mention the session of the user that we need to go to using that UID that we had mentioned before. Okay, so now it's time for a demo of how that would work. And here we go. So here we're getting sessions for, I had to, blur out for confidentiality. I had to blur out some information, getting all the latency values, and we display the sessions. And if we wanted to, we could filter the list by storefront server or Netscaler, or however we wanted to any of the fields. But since we have such a small list of sessions, we don't really need to do so here. So now what we're going to do is, why don't we take one of my sessions and send myself a message. So we click OK, and I want to send a message to myself. So I click on that. Again, I click on OK, and that brings up another screen, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we send the message type, which can be exclamation, it can be question, it can be info, and we have a message title, and we have the text of the actual message itself. Okay, so I have 2 sessions running here. The session I'm sending the message from, and the session I'm sending the message to. And in just a second, you'll see that the message does come up. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Now I want to perform some maintenance, for example, on the session. So I want the user to log off, and after I send the message to the user saying to log off, for example, I say, okay, the user hasn't logged off. Maybe they're away from their machine, and so I want to disconnect the session or log off or what have you. So I then say, yes, I want to go ahead and log the user off. I click OK, and in just a moment, you will see the session on the left go bye-bye. And as it just did. And then it goes back, and it will then go get my sessions for the remaining, my values for the remaining sessions. Now, if you noticed, if those over there, those red error messages that came up there for a second, that was because since I disconnected the user session, we had some values that were no longer valid, because it retains the latency information even though the user had been disconnected, but since the user was disconnected, that latency information is no longer valid, and that's why you will get those messages, which can be safely ignored. Okay, how are we holding on time? Okay, we're good. Okay, so let's take a minute to talk about that screen that we had used to send a message to the user. While you could build the screen using nothing but Notepad, using Visual Studio or something similar to that will make things much easier. And the reason why I'm using Visual Studio, there are paid products that will be even easier than Visual Studio, but I'm trying to give you a method where you don't need to incur any extra charges. So with Visual Studio, you can drag and drop, those of you familiar with Visual Studio, you can drag and drop fields onto your screen, and once you design, that will design the form for you, and it will also create for you, there's some behind the scenes, it will create for you a subroutine called initialize component that you see on the right-hand side here. Excuse me. Then all you need to do is simply take the output of the entire initialize component routine and save it to a file. Once you do that, I created a PowerShell routine called convert Visual Studio form, convert VS form, which will basically take that output from Visual Studio and it will remove anything that PowerShell will choke on, and it also converts the fields from Visual Studio syntax to PowerShell syntax, and then you simply need to copy that code into your script. And then you can actually, the output from the convert VS form is actually an executable PowerShell commandlet that you can actually use. Now, you won't be able to do much with that because all it does when you create the Visual Studio form is it creates the form, but you still have to add some code to the back end, like once the user clicks the send message button, you actually have to add the code by yourself manually to actually issue the send message command, to invoke the send message commandlet to actually send the message to the user. And the way you do that is by assigning field names to each of the objects that you're going to be using. So for example, if you assign the field name button send to the send message button, then you simply need to add an add click routine to your PowerShell module, that instead of here, in this case, I just have a message box that says I've been clicked, but actually in real life, you would, instead of having I've been clicked, you would actually invoke the send message commandlet from the XA/XD PowerShell commandlets to send a message to the user. Now, what other enhancements could I possibly make to this this PowerShell script? Well, as you noticed, we had a hard code list of DDCs at the beginning of the PowerShell commandlet, at the beginning of the PowerShell script. What we can do is we can create a screen to accept the list of DDCs, and this way you don't have to hard code it. And also we can create the screen in case, most of the times you will be invoking this particular command script from your own administrator credentials, but you may want to invoke it using an alternate set of credentials. And so you may want to create a screen that says, I want to invoke an alternate set of credentials. And if you do that, what would happen is, when you simply, in order to do that, you just simply issue this get credential, which is also a standard PowerShell commandlet. And what get credential does is it will throw up an NTLM pop-up, which will ask you for your credentials. It will then encrypt those credentials and assign them to this PowerShell commandlet, credentials, creds. And then when you issue your invoke command that we had seen earlier, you just pass a credential object on the command line, and it will use those alternate set of credentials to issue your invoke command. And again, you would do that when the credentials that you want to use for accessing your DDC are different than the ones that you're using to run the script. Another enhancement you might want to make is to compile it to an exe. There are a number of products out there that can take PowerShell scripts and convert them to executables, so you don't have to run them within a PowerShell session. You can just double click on them like any regular executable. Now let's go through I don't know if, as I mentioned before, PowerShell also has speech capabilities. And what you need to do first is you need to tell PowerShell to load its speech capabilities because it's not loaded by default, which is what the add type does. The second line tells PowerShell to create a speech object. Remember, everything is always objects. And the last line tells PowerShell what you want to speak. PowerShell also has multiple voices. It comes different versions of PowerShell will have a different number of voices. I believe that pretty much every PowerShell version has the David and the Zira voice, and if you want to switch between voices, all you need to do is issue the command select voice, and then you can switch to that voice. Okay, so let's see a demo of that. So here, okay, I guess the best thing to do is just do it.
Hello, Citrix user group community. My name is David. What's yours?
Okay. So that's using the default David voice. I selected the voice, but if I didn't do that, again, David is the default voice. And let's switch to, if we want to see what voices are installed, we just simply need to issue the command get installed voices, and we see that David is a male and Zira is a female voice. And let's take a look at Zira's voice. And we do that again by just issuing the select voice.
Hi David. My name is Zira. This demo is really cool.
Yes, it is. And if I want...
Excuse me, Sam. This is a private conversation. You can end the demo now.
Yes, ma'am. And with that, let's see. I'm just going to finish up with a couple of slides. First of all, everybody, should hopefully be a member of the CUGC, Citrix User Group community. It has many local user groups, and there are many advantages to being a member of CUGC. One of them, actually, there's a Metro New York. If you're local in the New York Metro area, there is a user group meeting coming up July 11th, on Tuesday, July 11th, from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. I highly suggest that you go to it. And finally, I'm going to leave up, as I mentioned before, all of the code as well as this presentation is available. All you need to do is send me an email, and I will be more than happy to send you all of this information. And if there are any questions, Samuel, are there any questions that came through?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. First of all, there are a couple of people who asked for downloading the script, so I already answered them, but it will be available. That is by sending you an email. And there is a few questions about, the first one was about NetScaler connected via IP. The question was, is it possible to have the F5 session, for example, or is it working only with NetScaler?
I'm sorry. Oh, F5. No, this will not work for F5. The Get-BrokerSession commandlets will only return information for NetScaler. It will, however, if you've launched your sessions through, you obviously launch your sessions through Storefront, it will still return your Storefront information, even if you go through an F5.
Okay, perfect. The second one is about compatibility of the script. Which version of XenApp and the stuff is it
good question.
working with?
Yep, good question. So I've tested these scripts with XenApp 6.5 and above. The log off and disconnect functionality works best with 7.11, I believe, and above. But all the rest of the functionality, I believe the sending message to users, etc., will work with 6.5 and above.
Okay. And I have the last one, which yes. You show us that you can send a message to one user. Is it possible to have a message sent to a lot of users, or more than one?
It is not possible. Okay, the answer is yes and no. It is possible using the Get-BrokerSession, not the Get-Broker message commandlets. I have not done so in this script, but if that's something, I mean, you can play around with, people can play around with that to send. You would have to send a list of sessions, which is a little bit more complicated, but if anybody needs help with that, then they can email me directly and we can see what we can do. But it is possible to do that, but this script will only send, it can only send a message to one user at a time. Now, I've deliberately, I would suggest not changing it to disconnect or log off more than one user at a time. Only whenever there's any type of a command that's destructive, such as logging off a user or disconnecting a user, I like to do it one at a time, just as a fail-safe. You're really not that concerned if you send a message to more than one user at a time, but if you disconnect the wrong user, you'd probably be a lot more concerned about that.
Yeah. And so there are a couple of questions about which counters you can get, because for example, someone asked for bandwidth used by a user session. So it's all about Microsoft counters, performance. So
I'm sorry, what about Microsoft counters?
Yeah, someone asked if it's possible to get bandwidth used by a user session.
I'm sorry.
The bandwidth used by a session.
Oh, the bandwidth.
I think it's
Yes.
I think it's possible because it's available on the performance counters. But
Yes, I believe. Yeah, you can add instead of or in addition to. You can get the. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yes, you can get the bandwidth used as well. That is an additional performance counter. And there are a number of performance counters that are installed that you can probably use as well.
And another one is about the refresh of the dashboard. Is it possible to have an automatic refresh?
Again, all of these are possible. It's not built into the dashboard right now, but you can automatically refresh it. Like right now, whenever you finish an action, if you disconnect the session or after you send a message to the user, when you go back, it'll refresh the list of sessions, as we saw. But if you wanted to do it automatically, you simply need to add that to the PowerShell script, and that could be done automatically.
And I have a personal one. If I had a lot of users, if I had a lot of users in one site, do you have make some tests on thousands of users, for example, or?
Okay, well, what I would suggest is, as I mentioned before, getting the latency information, getting the performance counters requires you to go to the actual hosting server. If you're getting just the list of sessions, and now at the top of the script, I didn't mention this, but at the top of the script, you'll see a variable that says retrieve latencies. I believe I set the value of retrieve latencies initially to true. If you change it to false, it will get you the list of sessions, but without the latencies, which is much, much faster, because it only has to go to the DDC to get all the list of sessions. It doesn't have to go to each individual host server to get the actual latency information, or if you're interested in the bandwidth. So a list of thousands of users is fine if you turn off latencies. If you're going to retrieve latencies, depending upon how many hosting servers you have, it can take quite a bit of time. So again, one of the questions that you might ask is there a way to filter to retrieve latency information from only a particular server if you had to, which would obviously make things a lot faster if you didn't have to get latencies from all 1,000 sessions. And the answer is yes. It's not in the script, but it is possible to add that to the script.
Thank you. And the last question is how to retry the code, but you already answered to that. Just send an email. So that's it.
Any other questions, Samuel?
No.
Okay. So Stephanie, if there are no other questions, thank you everybody for listening. I will transfer control back to you, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you. And if you do have more questions, I did put in the chat window a link to the discussion thread for this webinar, and you can go out there, ask Sam more questions. We'll make sure he sees them. And Sam, what I might do is send you a transcript of the questions that were asked today and just get a couple of quick answers that we can put out in the forum, because I'm pretty sure that there will be more discussion about this going forward.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank
great.
you everybody for listening. Okay.
And then also I put in the chat window a link to our survey. It's very short and anonymous, and we do read your feedback. We do take your suggestions, and it does help us when we're planning more user shares and webinars for the future, as well as just general content for the CUGC site. So please do fill that out and let me know if you have any feedback. Also, just a reminder, we'll send you a link tomorrow with a recording to the recording of this webinar, and also remind you to go out to mycugc.org, find your local group, see if there's a special interest group that you can be a part of, and get involved. And with that, I'll wish everyone a great evening and afternoon, and see you all soon out on mycugc.org. Thank you again, Sam, and thank you, Samuel.
Thank you. Okay. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.